Thank you everyone for coming tonight for my presentation, The Rat Poison Problem, How Rodenticides Are Harming Wildlife, Pets, and People. My name is Laura Kiesel. I have an academic background in wildlife biology, and I've also worked over the years as a journalist. And my master's degree is in natural resources sciences and management. And I was asked right before we went live how many of these I've done, and I've kind of lost count. I think I'm around 15 or 16, maybe more, but I've been doing these since 2018. And things have changed, so my presentation has evolved quite a lot over the years as the political landscape has changed, as the ecological landscape has changed. I wanted to start this presentation with a quote from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring because I find it really relevant to today. The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can only do so when in full possession of the facts. So I am hoping tonight to try to arm you with as many facts as I can about this topic, so that then you can make informed decisions going forward about rat poisons. So right away, I changed the order of this because I just wanted to put this out there right away, is that we seem to be having more of a rat problem, especially in metro areas. Carlisle's a little more rural, but you're still in the larger Boston metro area, so you're probably encompassed in that. And I wanted to first just really quick tick off some of the reasons we're noticing more rats. Climate change is a big one. Warmer winters. Usually in the past in New England, rats would actually not really reproduce much, if at all, during cold winters. But now that we have relatively warm winters, they're reproducing all year round, and they're also having larger litters due to the warmer weather. And also there's increased human population and density, and whenever you have more people, you have more trash. Wherever you have more trash, you're gonna have more rodents. Also, we're in a construction boom, which we've been in for about a decade. Not necessarily that development or construction increases rodent populations, but when you're having a lot of construction, you're gonna disrupt their burrows, so you're gonna notice a lot more rodents too, just because of that, and that makes them migrate more, and so people will see them more. Increased urbanization, again, that goes along with increased density. And the pandemic also led to some changes when restaurants closed down. In 2020, 2021, the rats migrated a lot into more residential areas, so people might have noticed them there. And also just because more people now work from home since the pandemic and telecommute, you just may see them or notice them more around your home because you're just home a lot more. But finally, and I'm gonna get more into this, I think one of the reasons we're noticing more rat is because of the poison itself, ironically, and I'm gonna get into the reasons why along the course of this presentation. So as I said, I'm a journalist. I wanna just give a quick recap as to how I became involved in this issue. As I said, my academic background is in wildlife biology. In 2015, so almost a decade ago, I was walking outside of my apartment complex one day. It was April 2015, and a pest control professional was laying down 20 bait stations. We had no rodent problems at the time in our building. I asked him why he was doing that. He said it was to prevent rodents. We did have a construction project that was coming down the line in a few months along Massachusetts Avenue where our building was located, but it was being used as a preventative. First, he made it sound like they were traps, and I said, well, those aren't traps, that's poison, right? The rodent enters it, exits it, and anything that eats that rodent could become poisoned. And he said that that was absolutely not true, that nothing else became poisoned but the rodents themselves, which is not true. I actually later that day called the pest company, got the EPA label, looked up the poison, saw all the warning signs, read up a lot on it. I went to my landlord, asked them to please take these poisons away. He was quite alarmed by what I showed him. He said, okay, we're gonna pull these poisons. Then the pest company told him that I had no idea what I was talking about, that these had no secondary impacts. Again, I'm a wildlife biologist by degree and training. And so they put them back. And then started my multi-year battle with starting with my own landlords, but then talking to my own town officials, and from there to ask them to stop. Because I noticed, not just my building, but suddenly I started to see these bait stations proliferate. Before 2015, I barely saw a bait station, and suddenly within a year or so, I saw them on every single block. Like they grew like mushrooms, it seemed, almost out of nowhere. You'd see them. And we didn't really have much of a rodent problem that I was aware of. I never saw a rat in Arlington until about 8 or 9 months after these poisons became a mainstay. This was my first article that was written in 2018 that looked in it. So if people want to Google it, I talked a lot about different types of alternatives being used in Boston, what the history of rat poisons were. And then I followed that up with a 2021 article when we started losing bald eagles in my town. And that I expanded a little outward more, looking at the EPA, why are they still allowing these poisons, looking at the pest control industry, what are the rules restricting them. This article, which was also syndicated in Salon, was shortlisted for an investigative reporting award. I didn't get the award, but I was one of 5 finalists. And that got a lot more attention to this issue nationally. So I want to just define a little the parameters of what we're talking about tonight. There are lots of different rat poisons, but the ones that are used the most are anticoagulant rodenticides, and in particular, second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, which is a mouthful, which is why people usually call them by their acronym, which is SGARs. I'm not even going to say all those names right now, but those are the 4 primary ones that are registered for use in the US. There are also FGARs, and there are some others like bromethalin, which is a neurotoxin, and cholecalciferol, which is vitamin D. So just these poisons work by stopping the blood from clotting. It interferes with the production of vitamin K in the bloodstreams of whatever animal ingests it, whether by firsthand exposure or if they eat something that's eaten this poison, and it can cause massive internal hemorrhaging if they get enough in their system. These poisons were causing a lot of children to become poisoned, and they were banned by the US EPA from over-the-counter shelves in 2015. But you can still find them. It's kind of a loophole in bulk quantities online in places like Amazon. Both California and British Columbia have moratoriums on all uses of SGARs, though they do have some exemptions for a few sectors like agriculture, wineries, and breweries. In more recent years, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire have recently considered state bans. There were introduction legislation proposed, but they did not pass. But my understanding is that, well, I think Rhode Island, it might still be pending. I know Connecticut and New Hampshire, they did not pass, but I think both states, the advocates working there are going to be submitting another iteration. So I had been doing this advocacy work, like I said, since 2015. But due to circumstances of wildlife losses in our own town, as we were ramping up efforts to try to get more warrants passed on the municipal level to kind of rein them in, I decided to form a group. A town meeting member named Alan Jones came up to me and asked me if I wanted to start a website, and he'd let me use his account for free. So we decided on the name Save Arlington Wildlife, and so that started around late 2021, early 2022, and it started mostly as a website to help garner support for the warrants that were coming downtown meeting that session. But then after that, I started trying to work with other people in other municipalities who wanted to start their own Save Wildlife groups and do the similar warrants that we did in Arlington. And I still work with groups who want to do that, and I'll talk with them about what we did here in Arlington, and we collaborate both to have these municipalities pass these warrants, but also to try to push for state-level legislation. I picked the name Save Arlington Wildlife. I like the idea of other groups using Save or Rescue, insert community name wildlife, because I wanted people to really sort of think about how wildlife is everywhere. It's not just in these rural or remote landscapes. I actually did one of my fellowships working on wildlife ecology in Alaska, and I have to say I've had more profound and up-close interactions with wildlife here in the Boston metro area than I ever did in Alaska, with the exception of moose. I just wanted people to appreciate that even in urban and exurban landscapes, we have a rich biodiversity in our own backyards. And also, I wanted people to think sort of like that, think globally, act locally, and take that even in the name of their group. So as I said, in 2022, Arlington Town Meeting, we passed, it's kind of complicated, but ultimately we passed a resolution urging the town manager to ban the use of these poisons, eschars, on its public lands. We also became the first municipality to submit a home rule petition to the state legislature to ask to ban on private property, because unfortunately, the state does not allow municipalities to ban on private property without state permission. And that is true of most states in the country. And I'll get into a little more about that as well, because that is by design. So we banned it on our public lands. We submitted the home rule petition to ban on private property as well.
Recording stopped.
Should I keep going? Okay, it sounds like there might be a pause in the recording.
Recording in progress.
And then in 2023, someone who works as a city councilor in Newton, Emily Norton, and she's also the executive director of the Charles River Watershed Association. She wanted to do these in the city of Newton, and she asked me to kind of help her and testify at the city council meetings. And so that passed actually unanimously, like very quickly, because it was right after MK the Bald Eagle died, and there was like a lot of, public awareness at the time. So I also wanted to mention a little bit why rat poison doesn't actually work. Well, one, you're luring rodents to the area. Like, it's called bait for a reason. You are actively attracting rodents to the area. So if they're not already there, and as I said, in my experience, a lot of times they're put down as a preventative, you're baiting them if they're not already there. And if they're already there, if you just keep poison down on a perpetual basis, you're leaving out a constant food source for them. So they're not going to go away. In fact, the EPA and the USDA do not recommend them for extensive or long-term use. They're only supposed to be used short-term and then taken away. So this, where we see them all the time on every street corner, and they're just being perpetually like replaced and restocked, that's actually against the EPA's own recommendations. The other problem is these anticoagulant rodenticides, the rodents can build biological resistance to them, like immunity similar to antibiotics. The whole reason we have a second generation of these poisons is because rodents became resistant to the first generations. And so when scientists were designing the second generation chemicals, the successors, in addition to making them a lot stronger and more deadlier, they also created them so that there's a lag time so that an animal that eats it, they can get a rodent can get a fatal dose in the first sitting and the first bit that they eat, but it won't kill them till days or even a week or more later. So by the time that, like, say they do succumb to the poisons, if they succumb, they've eaten so much of the poison that now they have such a higher chemical load that they themselves are much more toxic to a predator, because they've eaten much more what is the lethal dose for a smaller animal. But they did that because rodents are so smart that if they were to get sick or die very soon after, they or their kin could actually figure out, oh, we need to avoid these boxes. So that lag time is there to try to allow rodents not to make a correlation so that they'll still use it. But that also means that they eat a lot more of it. And similarly, they have noted, and it's been recorded, that they are building biological resistance to these second generation anticoagulants the way they did the first generations, but their predators are not. And that's because rodents they breed so rapidly that they can just outbreed these poisons and start building biological immunity, but their predators can't. So there's this mismatch there. So we're creating these super resistant rats while we're decimating their predators. And that's a bad recipe. That means we're gonna have a lot more rodents. And so I'm gonna speak a little about what really ramped up action in Arlington. So in 2021, over in Waltham, a few few towns over from Arlington, we had the first bald eagle death, confirmed bald eagle death. There were there was another one in Cape Cod in 2018, but this one the state actually was had banned it and was following, so they were able to do a necropsy and confirm that she died from anticoagulant exposure. That picture on the left is of her just a couple of weeks, I think, before she perished. And then she was reported dead on her nest, reportedly on top of her unhatched eggs. And her necropsy report said she still had eggs inside her, and her ovum was full of blood. And a lot of times laying eggs itself can cause hemorrhaging, or giving birth for wildlife can cause these hemorrhaging if they have these anticoagulants in their system. I just want to give a little bit of a trigger warning. I don't have super gory photos, but there will be some photos of dead wildlife. So just be aware that is happening. I don't want to be insensitive to the audience because I know it can be a heavy topic. Around the same time in 2021, we actually got our first breeding pair of bald eagles nesting in our borders for the first time in 60 years, since DDT wiped the species out of the state and most of the nation. This was one of the eagles that were their first hatchlings. I think they had tried to have hatchlings a couple of years before somewhere else, but they didn't survive past nestling stage. These two bald eagles, C25 and C26. They hatched, and I had watched them all summer long. As you can see on that left hand, that was like nestling stage going, not quite fledgling yet, where he sort of looks like a dark crystal character. And then in the middle, that was 4th of July. Because I figured that was a very good thing to, very appropriate thing to do on 4th of July is to visit the bald eagle nest that didn't exist a few months prior. But unfortunately, only a couple of weeks later. Oh, and actually, I want to talk about this before I go to the last picture. So we went on the 4th of July. We watched C25 and her sibling, C26, at the nest. We watched MK, their mother, come in with a large rat, and we watched them tear this rat apart and eat it. And I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but you might notice there are little green flecks of color on her bottom wing. That's actually the poison. So these poisons are a phosphorescent green or blue, and if a rat or a mouse has recently eaten it, it dyes their inside of their intestinal tracts. So it will actually, you can see it if the animal, like the predator, is eviscerating it. So that looked like green splatter, and I really hoped I was wrong. But there was buildings with bait boxes all around where their nest is located. And then only a couple of weeks later, I heard that C25 was acting listless, and then she kind of fell face first onto the ground, and she was rushed off to Tufts Wildlife Clinic, but she died only an hour or two later. And a necropsy also confirmed that she died of Escar's poisoning. And so that was 2 bald eagles in only a few months' time. And this is a big deal because, again, bald eagles were completely extirpated from Massachusetts by 1970 due to DDT. DDT was banned in 1972. They were federally endangered for decades. It took decades to rebound these creatures. Biologists had to take eggs and hand raise them with like eagle puppets to help thousands of these animals survive and reintroduce them into the wild. And even though they were federally endangered to 2007, recovery has been slower in a lot of states, particularly a lot of the northeastern states. So they were still listed as endangered till 2012 in Massachusetts, and they were actually threatened till only 2020 until they were put down to species of special concern. So the fact that several of them died of this other pesticide only within less than a year after they were demoted from threatened status, to me seems pretty profound. Like, we're not really learning our lessons, we're repeating our history. And they're still technically a mesolisted species and should be protected. That was the first time I ever saw MK the bald eagle in April 2021. I think she had just probably around that time laid her eggs, but I hadn't known that yet. And she was flying and then landed on this post on the Mystic, and I took that picture, and I love it because she just seems so, like, it makes her seem almost more vulnerable to watch her preening, not like, not necessarily like hunting or anything, but just in this kind of moment with her guard down, like just kind of grooming herself. So then in 2023, so a year and a half ago, I got news that MK herself, the mother, was acting ill. She was on the ground even though the sun had set. They're not a species that are nocturnal, so if you see them at dusk or like when it's getting dark, she was acting addled. That's not a good sign. So she was rushed to the New England Wildlife Center. She was showing all the signs of anticoagulant poisoning. She was defecating and urinating blood. And I believe she did choke on a lung hemorrhage, and she perished. They did not complete the necropsy because I think her carcass tested positive for bird flu, but it's also very clear that anticoagulant poisoning played a role. They did take blood tests and found high levels of anticoagulants in her blood. And blood is not the most perfect testing. It's usually liver, but it was still very high, which shows she had a recent exposure. Around that same time, in between the deaths of C25, the bald eaglet, and MK, we also had a nest of great horned owls at our town park. And I and many others like to go there, especially during the breeding seasons, and watch them. I don't know if anyone has ever watched great horned owls when they do their duets together. So great horned owls, like many birds of prey, often mate for life, some bald eagles as well. But great horned owls will do this duet every night where they sing back and forth at different registers. And this, and during the breeding season, they do this a lot. And it's really quite a thing to watch. So we watched them all courting all winter. We watched the mother incubate the eggs, raise the babies to fledgling. They were actually just about to leave the nest, and that's the picture in the top left-hand corner of the mother with her two babies. Then a few days passed and no one saw them, and then they found the mother and the baby on the ground. And they were not tested, they were not necropsied, but they were spilling bright red blood out of their mouths post-mortem. And the animal control officer also did a quick cut them open to see what was inside, and it was just like Kool-Aid, like their insides had liquidated. And then the third fledgling was found a few days after that, dead. The only survivor was the male owl. As I said, they mate for life, so we would go and check on him and hear his side of the duet, and then we'd hear no response, and then we'd see him fly around and more frantically hoot his side of the duet. And that went on for about 6 months, and then he found a new mate, and then 2 weeks later, she was found on the ground, and that's her on the right-hand corner. And so she was rushed to a wildlife rehabber, but she died en route. And we crowdfunded to make sure she was necropsied, so no one could sow any doubt, like, oh, you don't know for sure. And it was definitely Escar's poisoning. She had extremely high rates in her liver associated with lethal toxicosis. Around that time, too, there was like a Cooper's hawk nest that I watched with several. They had 5 fledglings, and then one of those fledglings also was found in someone's backyard shortly after they left the nest. And we crowdfunded and got him necropsied as well. A lot of people don't even think of Cooper's hawks as very vulnerable because they primarily eat small songbirds. Rodents are not their main staple, but he died of Escar's poisoning. And that also started to really, that is when we also started doing a lot more crowdfunding on a regular basis to necropsy these animals that we were finding, because the state, if it's not a MISA-listed species like a bald eagle, the state does not test them. And so this is just a less than a handful of the species we've tested. And when I say we, I mean like there's a coalition of us, not just Save Arlington Wildlife. We work with wildlife rehabbers like Cape Ann Wildlife, but we've helped crowdfund I think 62 species in the past year and a half in the Boston metro area. 10 or 12 of those have been in Arlington. Every single one has been exposed, and I think all but one, it has usually was in that lethal toxicosis range. And that second to the right picture, that was just from this weekend. I picked up a barred owl that was in Arlington Center. I thought he had died, but he had not died yet. He started moving. I thought maybe we could save him, but he died en route to the rehabbers. And she sent me the picture to say there's blood coming up his mouth. So we've just sent him off yesterday to be necropsied, and we'll be getting the results back in a week. And so we're taking many tactics to try to get these poisons further restricted. Save Arlington Wildlife, along with Cape Ann Wildlife and Newhouse Wildlife Rescue and several other groups, we are part of a legal petition to the state, and Harvard Clinic Animal Law and Policy Clinic is representing us pro bono, where we are asking the state to suspend the use of these poisons because their guidelines are that these poisons aren't supposed to do undue environmental harm, or if there's any suspicion they are, they're supposed to suspend use while they investigate further. So that is what we're saying we're confident is happening. And that goes to the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources and their pesticide board. And we're still waiting for a response. We submitted this in May, and they still have not responded whether or not they will be suspending the use of these poisons. And it's not just our anecdotal evidence or the necropsies that we've helped crowdfund. I mean, Tufts Wildlife Clinic right here in Massachusetts is one of the leading experts in the nation on AR exposure in birds of prey. Dr. Maureen Murray, who's a wildlife veterinarian there, has done multiple tests. She first looked from 2006 to 2012 at, I think it was like 60, I don't remember exactly how much, but I think it was about 60 different, but like birds of prey. And the exposure rate was 86%. She then replicated that again a few years later, doing from 2012 to 2016, and it jumped from 86% to exposure rate was now 96% of the birds of prey they surveyed. Then she did a separate study looking at it was either 43 or 44 red-tailed hawks. The exposure rate was 100%. And red-tailed hawks, they're our most common raptor, but they are declining. And they are very rat-heavy diets, especially those in urban and suburban areas. But they're not just deadly to raptors. There's been many reports of foxes, coyotes, skunks, raccoons, possums, bobcats out in California. They've been poisoning mountain lions and even felling mountain lions, again, to give you the impression of how, if something as large as a mountain lion can have impacts, what it means for smaller creatures. Ravens and crows are very susceptible because they're scavengers. Even herons have been poisoned because they too will eat rodents. And some reptiles that eat rodents a lot, like snakes, rat snakes, have also been found to be susceptible. With some of our smaller mesocarnivores, like skunks, raccoons, possums, they get both first-hand and second-hand exposure because those skunks or raccoons are really wily and strong, and they can break open those bait boxes and get that first-hand exposure. But they also do eat rodents as a supplement to their diet. Oh, another thing I want to mention is when it doesn't always cause direct hemorrhaging, it actually makes some of these species more susceptible to mange. And it can kill, the mange can wind up being what has killed them. That's happened a lot here with coyotes and foxes for sarcoptic mange, but it's also killed mountain lions, and it actually almost extirpated a population of bobcats in California just from the anticoagulants. They had a fatal mange outbreak. They've never died from that before, and 90% of the population crashed. Pets are also vulnerable. We don't have the kind of robust data we have for wildlife, but, and again, usually they don't do necropsies like on pets the way they do on wildlife. But MSPCA, which I work closely with on this issue, they say they see dozens of cases of rodenticide poisoning annually at their 2 vet centers, that cases peak during spring and fall. And the cost of veterinary care can exceed $2,000 and take weeks of supportive care and medication. And that's if they survive. That's a picture of my cat, Samson, and he caught a mouse in my apartment. And luckily, he didn't do anything but put it in his box with his toy mice. But I was very scared because we had a lot of poison bait boxes still around the building at the time. This, for example, is a very heartbreaking story. A friend of mine who lives in New York, she went to an Airbnb that was designated dog-friendly with her 2 rescue greyhounds. And her greyhound likes to eat grass like a lot of dogs too. And what happened, because there was such heavy flooding and storms, the bait flooded onto the grass, and he died the next day. And she actually did get like a pathology report to show it was anticoagulant poisoning, and she's been sort of in a battle with Airbnb to stop designating their properties pet or dog friendly if they're using these rat poisons, because she lost her dog. And it endangers children. As I mentioned, the reason that this was banned from over-the-counter sales, the SCARs, was because thousands of children were getting poisoned annually. Prior to 2015, you could buy these over-the-counter, and they came in pellets that looked like candy, and you could buy them loose. And that's why now they have to be in bait stations. They have to be bigger baits. But I do want to point out that even though the SCARs, child poisonings have decreased, FGARs, child poisonings have increased 60 to 80% because those are still available over the counter. So it's more like it's shifted what is poisoning the children, and it's still anticoagulants, though FGARs more than SGARs. And what happened in 2014, just to give you a little bit of an idea about like sort of the mentality of the pest control industry, they tried, so the EPA had to be sued to take action on this. The Environmental Justice Coalition in Harlem sued them because so many children in Harlem were getting poisoned. Again, these poisons were disproportionately poisoning low-income children of color. So this was also an issue of environmental racism. The poison control industry, as well as one of their lobbying firms, said that this was an acceptable amount of child poisonings to occur. I don't think any child poisoning should be able to be acceptable for occurring. But so EPA was sued, and EPA turned around and did try to pull these from the shelves. But I can never say their name, Benckiser, they refused. They tied them up for several years in court until they finally agreed, like, okay, we'll pull these from the shelves, but we're not going, but then we want them to be able to be used by pest companies. And again, I feel like that kind of gave the pest companies an aggressive monopoly, because again, I really started to see these poison bait stations proliferate subsequent to 2015 after it was pulled from the shelves. So they're allowed now to be used in so-called tamper-resistant bait stations in order to try to reduce exposures to children, pets, and wildlife. But there's a lot of problems with that. One, tamper-resistant is not tamper-proof. This is a bait station, as you can see, that I came across on Massachusetts Avenue in Arlington, and it's cracked, and I don't know if you can see it, but the corner of the bait was exposed. And this was next to a Petco where they were doing a puppy training class, and they were going right by these, like walking the puppies by this, and so I had that removed. Again, wildlife themselves are strong enough often to break in. This was also a case where we had squirrels breaking into the bait boxes, as you can see. In the left-hand corner, that squirrel has bait in its mouth, and it's eating it, and it gave it to its family members, and a few days later, several of the squirrels dropped out of the trees, like literally dropped dead and fell out of the trees. So we've had, and that was several cases where squirrels were breaking into bait boxes around Arlington and doing that. But again, the main problem too is even if you had tamper-proof bait stations, the rodents themselves become the poison source, and they leave the bait stations. This was a red-tailed hawk I watched for a couple of hours, was really enjoying photographing him. I'm like, what is he looking at? I watched him stalk. He was stalking a rodent that was going into and coming out of a bait station. So you see he's in that tree on the left-hand corner, and then he swooped down, and there's a bait station right behind those grassy hedges. And luckily, someone came out of the apartment and scared him away. But I've seen that. I've actually watched hawks stalking trash areas and watching the rodents go in and out of bait stations. The EPA is well aware of this problem. Every few years, they do what's called an ecological risk assessment. They always find that these have profound impacts on wildlife. And this was the conclusion of its last report in 2020. which was the nature of risk to mammals and birds from anticoagulant rodenticides is well established and includes mortality from primary and secondary exposure, as well as chronic growth and reproduction effects. So, and even when it's not causing direct hemorrhaging, it makes the animals more susceptible to things like window strikes. If people heard of Flacco the owl, he hit a window, but he had a lot of poison in his system. A lot of these animals are a lot more likely to get hit by cars. They're more likely to get mange, like I said. They're more likely to get other types of infections. So even if they're not dying of acute toxicosis, they're getting, what are called sublethal impacts. So when people ask me, well, why would the EPA do this? The EPA, and I think the EPA is really important, but unfortunately I do think a lot of their workers, they have a revolving door with the industry they watchdog. This isn't news, and there's been a lot of articles in the past few years. There were like a handful of whistleblowers who work in the chemical safety assessment department who said that they were told to basically tone down like what they were saying in their assessments, to say things were safe that weren't safe. They were told they would be fired if they wouldn't say that. I think some of them were terminated when they did do whistleblowing. So this has been going on, and it's not just rodenticides, right? Other pesticides, other chemicals this has happened with. So when the state says, well, we want to wait till what the EPA says, I don't really think the EPA should be our only authority on this, because their own papers have concluded that this is a problem, that these are problematic chemicals. Also, the EPA has only takes data from a handful of states or less. Only a few states actually collect any data on poisoning. So that conclusion that they reached was still with a huge scarcity of data. So New England Wildlife Centers here in Massachusetts, they told me in 2021 when I interviewed them for my article that they treat between 100 and 200 cases of poisoning, anticoagulant poisoning a year in their wildlife. That's just like, I think they have 2 centers in one part of the state, and they were saying that that's how many they were seeing were hundreds. And just to put that in sort of a comparison, EPA said that there have been 600 reported rodenticide cases in the entire country in 10 years. So there's obviously like a huge gap in data happening. The other thing Nuke told me that I found really profound was that they said that the patients are taking longer to recover. It used to take them a few weeks. Now it's taking them months. This owl in this photo, and this photo is from Nuke. He came from a nest. Both parents died. Another sibling died. As you can see, he's very, he was bleeding profusely from his mouth and nostrils. They tried to do a blood transfusion. He still died. The only survivor was his sibling. It took 9 months of daily vitamin K infusions for his blood to clot on its own again so he could be released. And they said that at the time that had been unprecedented. No animal had ever taken that long to recover. But that is how much poison he had in his system to recover from. They also said that the bulk of the cases they do get tend to be from Boston Metro West area, which makes sense because we're such an urbanized area. There's a lot of poison use here. Something that surprised me in 2021 when I was researching my article is that, I wanted to see what is the data that supports that these poisons are effective. I kept hearing how effective they are at reducing populations. I could not find a single peer-reviewed study. I looked for like 2 months. I would find papers that said these are very effective in reducing rodents, and then it would footnote to another study that said these are very effective in reducing rodents. I'd call these researchers, I'd say, is there a study? Can I get it? No one could offer it to me. The only studies that exist outside of labs, which aren't really transferable because in labs they're only testing one chemical in a very finite amount of animals, are very small islands that have little to no human habitation, where I don't know if you've heard sometimes for invasive species, they'll carpet bomb the island with poisons. And they killed, there was an island, I think it was called Rat Island in Alaska in the 1990s. They dropped thousands of pounds of escars just loose onto the island. No humans, I don't think that any humans lived on the island. And they did kill all the rats there, but it's a closed system, right? And that was like, and there was not a lot of food sources for the rats. And they also killed 46 bald eagles in that time too. They didn't even know they had 46 on the island, but they killed more than they even thought that existed on the island. And when I look at the data, what I'm struck by is that rodent sightings, a lot of boards of health will keep data of like calls in to report rat sightings. They've increased with the use of SCARs. So at the very least, the poisons are not really being effective in reducing them. Again, my theory is that they may actually be a contributing factor to increasing the populations, but at the very least, when people always say, well, I can't give up poisons because what am I going to do because I have rats everywhere? And I'm like, but you're using poison, right? And they're like, yeah, and I have rats everywhere. And I was like, but you're using poison and you say you've been using it for months or a year, but doesn't that mean the poison's not working if you're saying you still have a lot of rats? So let's maybe try to find another solution. Another thing that I was very surprised about, it took 2 months for them to get back to me, but I kept asking because as I mentioned when I had that first run-in with the pest control professional putting those poison bait stations around my complex, he would say things that were blatantly untrue. And I asked the EPA, is that legal? Can they tell me that these poisons don't impact wildlife, that there are no secondary impacts? Can they even tell me that that's not poison in the bait station? And they said that is completely legal. There's no federal law that prohibits it. Only, they said states could prohibit it if they want, but as Massachusetts does not prohibit that. There are some consumer laws, but it's not really relevant to this. So they can just lie. And I've had pest control companies tell me, oh, these are a special brand of third generation anticoagulants that have been specially formulated, and it's just SCARs. And I have receipts of that. I have people who think that they don't have poison on their property because they told them, we do not want the poisons that are killing the bald eagle. And then they're surprised when they look at the labels or they open up the bait station that they have these poisons. And again, I think what is really ironic is when we're putting down these poisons ubiquitously, we wind up killing one of our best natural defenses against rodents that help rein them in, which are their natural predators, right? So a single great horned owl can kill and eat 4,000 mice a year, and up to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 rats, just thousands of rodents. There's no poison that can compete with that kind of control. The rodents can't build biological immunity to the owls. They can't learn to avoid them the way they can stationary bait stations. Like I said, we had a family of 4 owls. That's I don't even know, 20,000 rodents that are now going to go on to live because the owls were not in our neighborhood anymore to consume them. Even the diminutive screech owl, those little guys that are like the size of a potato, even those guys kill over 1,000 mice a year, and they can take down juvenile rats as well. And this isn't just, me pontificating. There's been data to this extent. In California, which does have a moratorium on these poisons in most sectors, they had two test sites, one that had anticoagulant rodenticides, and another that used no poisons, but instead had things to encourage birds of prey, such as perches, like in that silhouette, or nest boxes for owls. And it wasn't even a contest. The site that encouraged natural predators experienced much greater rodent control by more than 50% than the ones with anticoagulant rodenticides. UC Davis has some ongoing studies, and this was one of their conclusions of one of them, that the use of anticoagulant rodenticides is likely to decrease the amount of natural pest control provided by owls, and therefore increase dependence on chemical inputs for rodent control. So there's the fact that, we're decimating our natural predator control of these rodents, which can artificially inflate their populations. The other thing I hear sometimes in defense of we need to use these poisons is, well, rats are such a public health issue. There's all these diseases they spread, and they do. I'm not trying to undermine that there's a valid public health threat, but I do think that the pest companies often overstate those threats. I've heard a lot of people who are really scared of rabies. Rodents are not a rabies vector species. I've heard about the plague, which I'll get into in a minute. But a thing I wanted to point out is what studies they've been finding is that rats that have these anticoagulants in their system are more likely to have and transmit diseases. Because again, like this weakens their immune system, so they're more likely to have leptospirosis or E. coli. So it actually makes them more of a vector of diseases for humans. The other problem, and I don't know to what extent this has been formally studied, but I know anecdotally I've seen this. When you do get dead or dying rodents who have these poisons, I come across them dead or dying in broad daylight in places with high foot traffic. Again, much more likely to spread diseases. Rodents by nature are usually going to try to avoid humans and human interaction, but once they're sick like this, they're not. Like the rat on the left, that was at Spy Pond Park, a very busy park. There were two kids playing like catch football 2 feet from this dead rodent, and someone was walking their dog a foot away when we picked up, and it was bleeding from its mouth, so I do think it was anticoagulants. This other poor rat that I watched struggle for hours, there were 20 bait stations at this house. This was 2 houses down from an elementary school, and school was letting out and little kids were walking by. So I had another rat I came across on Massachusetts Avenue at 4 p.m. on an August summer day. It was spasming. It was like making all these spasmodic movements. Blood was coming out of its mouth when it spasmed. And there were like, again, people were walking their dogs. Their little kids in flip-flops were walking right by it. A kid thought it was a toy and almost picked it up. Again, transmission seems much more likely with these poisons when the rodents are like this. So when people then say, well, what do we do instead? I think from everything I've read, from everyone I've talked to, and sometimes it's not the easiest answer that people want to hear about, it really comes down to prevention with better sanitation and exclusion. They've done multiple studies that show that this is far superior to poison. And to kind of break it down to different things that people, I changed the order of this. So I'm going to get into some of the ways we can do that. But to get back to why we hate and fear rats so much, which I do think will make us a little more, to think a little more about these sanitation, exclusion, more alternatives. When I talk about concerns about disease transmission, like the plague, concern about property damage. I know that rats can cause fires if they chew up your electrical wiring, and I know that that is a valid thing. But I do think there's a lot of stigma around rats, and it like has to do with a lot of folklore, movies, literature. I know that they get associated with poverty. So there's a lot of classism and racism sometimes that has been entrenched in what the rat symbolizes. And I think that it's important for us to interrogate that going forward, because I think that what allows us sometimes as a people to be okay with the poisoning and the suffering this causes the rats then allows it to become more societally acceptable for us to then poison their predators. But here's the reality about the rats. Again, they're not a rabies vector species. Chances of disease transmission from rat to human is actually extremely low. Rats, like I said, rats are more likely to have poisons in their system, are actually more likely to have and transmit diseases. A person is I think it's like 180 times more likely to be bitten by a dog than a rat. And a child is statistically more likely to be poisoned by rat poisoned than sickened by a rat, statistically speaking. The one thing I hear a lot is, the plague. I'm really worried about the plague. And rats have spread the plague. Actually, most experts now have debunked that rats spread the bubonic plague outbreak of the Middle Ages, but I also just want to let people know for modern day plague transmission rates, 7 to 8 people get the plague in the entire nation a year. So you have a 1 out of 30 to 330 million chance of getting the plague. And it actually is much more common in the Southwest or more arid desert environments. So again, I'm not trying to dismiss it at all as a concern, but you're more likely to get hit by lightning really than get the plague. But I hear it so often as a concern that I just want to say, when they do spread diseases, leptospirosis is one of the more common ones. And again, if they have those poisons in their system, they're more likely to have that disease and spread it. So again, the best way to prevent rodents is to manage waste. Some low-hanging fruit ways that you can do that in your own home. And, I think people are sometimes averse to this suggestion, but consider getting rid of your bird feeders. I am an avid birder. I love birds, but bird feeders are a huge attractant to rats, especially during the warmer weather seasons. So even if you don't want to get rid of them year-round, consider getting rid of them between early April and early December. And definitely if you do want to have your bird feeders, take them down overnight. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but it really is much less likely to get rats. They've done studies that have found that people who have bird feeders are triple more likely to have a rat burrow in or near, within a certain feet of their property, or in their backyard. The bird feeders also can spread disease among birds. It's not always the best for the birds themselves. Rinsing out your recyclables, maybe keeping your composting indoors. I'm also a big advocate of composting, but they have shown that sometimes as people have more of these open compost pits in their yards or not confined composting is also something that's attracting rats. So consider keeping your compost indoors, or if you do keep it outdoor, get a metal receptacle. Metal is the most rodent-proof thing with clasping lids and holes in them. Picking up your pet waste. And again, another really simple thing that people could do is to not take their trash to outdoor barrels or dumpsters until as soon as you can before pickup, either at least the night before, if not morning of. If you're well, I create a lot of trash, you could consider getting a trash compactor, because just those times that the trash is outside is really one of the things that's drawing the rodents. To keep it up another level, I've done some do-it-yourself exclusion. You can get exclusion services from a lot of problem animal control agents. And sometimes you can get it fairly affordably, but sometimes the bigger, foundational stuff can be expensive. But I can tell you, I've had good luck getting a lot of steel, wool, and copper, and tucking it into open holes, and then just using spray caulk over it. And that's pretty cheap. I would get aluminum foil. This was the one time I got a mouse in my building that I told you my cat got. I got aluminum foil and I lined all my cabinets and pantry and under my sink, because they don't like metal. They don't like walking on it. They won't chew on it. I never got a mouse again. Keeping your foods refrigerated or in rat-proof or rodent-proof, mouse-proof containers, which are usually metal or glass with clasping lids. If you're getting rodents in your yard, motion sensor lights, especially near the trash receptacles, can help, or sprinklers. There are also those owl or coyote decoys. Rats and mice are smart again, so people will say, well, I had it and it worked for a while, but then it stopped working. Yes, because the rats figured out that it's fake because you left it in the same spot. So you do have to move it around every few days or a week, or get the ones that have moving heads, because otherwise they will figure it out. But those can work if you're moving them around, at least as part of your a system that includes several of these steps. Not leaving pet food out overnight or for prolonged periods of time. There are some good deterrents. Fresh Cab is approved by the EPA. It's these satchels that you can put in sheds and enclosed spaces. It's kind of, I think, pine. And there's something called Nature's Mace, which is pepper, kind of like a pepper spray bait that you can put in your yard. They don't like cayenne pepper a lot of times, and so you can sometimes line your house with that. Again, you have to reapply it as it rains or as time goes by. And then there are bigger options like Contrapest, which is rodent birth control. Radex, which is a non-poison bait that fatally dehydrates rodents. It does not work up the food chain. And then old-fashioned snap traps. And there's also CO2 traps and electronic traps, which are a little more expensive, but sometimes can have a higher velocity if you're looking for lethal methods that are not going to work up the food chain or get non-target animals. And then there's dry ice, which if you have confirmed burrows in your yard, you can put the dry ice in those burrows and tuck them in. It releases carbon dioxide. Kind of puts them to sleep. And so also on a larger municipal level, even better even some things that we've done in Arlington and some other towns, putting more signage and more enforcement against feeding wildlife. I'm talking about waterfowl. people will just throw hunks of bread, having more enforcement or awareness about that as a rat attractant. Some parks have done carry-in, carry-out policies with mixed results, but when they do work, they work well. But sometimes you have to have like awareness campaign around it. But if you take the trash receptacles out and say, take your trash home with you. I know some complexes will do twice a week trash pickup. These big belly canisters can be really great to have in high traffic areas. I know they can be expensive, but they really are good at reducing rodents in the area. And I know some municipalities, I don't know if Carlisle has done it, but I know Arlington, Brookline, some other places have done contrapest pilots, which is, again, the contraception for the rodents, and smart boxes, which are like these high volume electronic traps that can kill like dozens of rodents. And also just getting new trash cans. Some towns and cities will order new trash receptacles for their residents that are rat resistant, have tight fitting lids, heavy duty plastic. So some of them have done that and they have good success. There's also some agencies that will, there's a place called Bin Bath that will come for places with dumpsters and like clean out the bin so that there's not a lot of debris, and that can also have a good impact. And I just think having more education, having more emphasis on exclusion, and I know in California, a lot of the pest companies have done a very exclusion-heavy model now that they can't use the anticoagulants. So this is something really to invest in. And having a website, like I don't know what the municipal website for Carlisle looks like, but maybe having a section with some of these do-it-yourself tutorials about how to compost or keep up your yard in ways that don't attract rodents. Again, ivy, dropped berries, a lot of things that people might be busy or not think about that could be helpful. Here in Arlington, where I live, we don't have curbside composting, which again could be helpful because it diverts food waste, but if you don't do it the right way, it can attract rodents. In Arlington, we have these huge like steel receptacles, similar to Big Belly trash cans, but instead of trash, it's for composting, but they're completely rat-proof, and we have several of these around town. They're really helpful, and I know they're very popular, so that's another way to divert food waste if you don't do a curbside composting that maybe like Carlisle and other municipalities can look into. And I know some towns and cities, I think, have looked into offering dry ice applications for some of their residents. And again, I have some of this, like I have on the Save Arlington Wildlife page, alternatives to rodenticide page on the site that you can look up a lot of these, and I have a lot of hyperlinks to different places. So I'm almost done. I just have a couple more slides, but to return to what I was talking about local control, because I was asked this at the beginning before the meeting started by someone in the live audience. So Arlington passed a home rule petition because we were not allowed by the state to ban on private property, right? This is actually something the pest control companies, the pest control industry fought for back in the 80s and 90s. The federal government decided that municipalities should have the right to regulate pesticides that occur in municipal borders. And the pest control industry did not like that, so the National Pest Management Association went to all the states and said, you got to take this right away from the municipalities, and so 43 states stripped away local authority from the municipalities when it comes to pesticide use on private property, and that, not just rodenticides, any pesticides. So as you can see, 43, and then there's another handful where the petition, where it's I think in the middle, it says can petition for control, which you can do in Massachusetts, but it's hard. So that is something they fought for, and I know, and they released this a couple of years ago in one of their newsletters, the National Pest Management Association, that they strongly believe that the EPA and state agencies should be the only regulatory entities responsible for pesticide registration, sale, and use. And that's because it's a lot easier for them to lobby the state than to go to all these municipalities, right? And because municipalities are often more, I would say not beholden, but because it's a smaller, even with big cities, I think sometimes it's easier for constituents to get things passed on the town or city level. But what bothers me about this is they're externalizing these costs, like the dead wildlife that we have to deal with in our town, but we're being told we can't ban the poisons that are causing these deaths. Because the state is taking that. So in addition to the home rule petition, the bill number has changed. It was H814. I don't know what it'll be this upcoming session. But in addition to the home rule petitions, Save Arlington Wildlife does advocate for the bill that gets introduced every legislative session for the past 7 sessions in the State House, where it would return local control to the states. That's a Boston Herald article when we had a rally the May before last, May 2023. And in addition to the home rule petition, we were also lobbying for that to pass. There are so many other local control actions that have helped make a difference environmentally, like the ban on plastic bags that a lot of places have done. I don't know if you guys have done that, but a lot of municipalities have banned single-use plastic bags at checkout, styrofoam containers, gas-powered leaf blowers. And if we had to wait for the state, there would be no changes. So I think it makes sense for us logically to ask for the local control of the use of these poisons too. So some things I recommend, if you're from a municipality that hasn't, consider starting your own Save Wildlife initiative. You don't have to call it Save Wildlife, but Rescue Wildlife, whatever works for you, but consider starting a group that can work on these and other issues impacting wildlife. Some of the things we did in addition to the home rule petition and the public lands ban, we started a poison-free pledge campaign to try to get some of the businesses to voluntarily and bigger landlords to start giving up these poisons voluntarily on their properties. We got our local housing authority in Arlington. They were using hundreds of bait stations to stop using these poisons, and another affordable housing nonprofit that was using it at their property. We petitioned them. Another thing that is a lot of boards of health, when there's new construction, they will require a pest control plan for that new construction during demolition. And it varies a little bit, but I find that a lot of municipalities, those departments of health or public works, whatever is in charge of that, will either require the pest companies to use poison, or they'll require bait stations, which I find incentivizes the use of poison. We found, I did a public records request to Arlington in 2021 when I was doing my article, and 29 or 30 out of 32 of the construction projects that happened in the town over that year used SCARs. And 27 of them, there was no sign of rodents in the area when they did a pre-assessment. So again, they were using it prophylactically and not, as a preventative, which doesn't help. But I got the town to stop doing that and actually instead use either use snap traps or not use anything unless there's an actual active rodent infestation. And so far as I've been told, they haven't used SCARs on a construction site. But that's another thing we did. And this has started a movement since Arlington did our home rule petition and public lands ban. Now 5 other municipalities have followed suit. Like I said, Newton, but also the town of Newbury and 3 communities in the Cape. And I know another at least 4 or 5 are doing it right now for their current town meeting or about to. And I think there are some 30 Save or Rescue Wildlife groups now in the Commonwealth. There's a couple also, I think, getting formed out in New York. So I think, it's great to keep the momentum up. And this is also another citizen science project that is in service to this. This is an app you can go to, and if you see black boxes, you can document them. You can say if they're not labeled. If they are labeled and they say they have an SCAR, you can say that. And also you can also put in things, if you do see a dead or dying rat nearby, if you do see dead wildlife. So it allows us to collect data, and we have thousands of entries. And finally, I just want to say, even the Boston Globe has, they wrote this editorial after I spoke to them in 2023, after MK died. where they supported our home rule petition, which they rarely will write an editorial where they will support like a home rule petition for a single community, but they did support the passage of it. The state is a real slog. Like our state legislative process in Massachusetts is very onerous. It's one of the most onerous state legislative processes in the nation. But in addition to the piecemeal home rule petitions, there is a precedent in Massachusetts where if you get enough home rule petitions on a single topic, if they get enough, they will independently revise their policies without going through that traditional legislative route. So it's not just about trying to get our home rule petition as an individual community passed or these other places. It's about a collective, like, sort of outcry, like, no, we want the state to allow us permission or do something about it as a state so that we don't have to bear the burden of this. So if another community is interested in a home rule petition, please know it's not just about trying to get that individual, and it's about trying to have a collective collaboration to say to the state, we want you to like independently revise these policies, maybe answer the legal petition that my coalition has submitted. But hopefully that will, as they get more in, they're going to have to do something, because at this point they're going to have almost a dozen home rule petitions within the next year or so that they're going to have hearings on every legislative session until they've let one pass. Ours and Newton's did get out of committee, which almost has never happened. So I think they're already starting to feel the pressure, but it didn't unfortunately make it to the House or the Senate floor. So I just want to wrap up. I started with a Rachel Carson quote. I wanted to end with another Rachel Carson quote. How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Again, it just feels so relevant today, even though that was about DDT. Yet this is precisely what we have done, and we have done it, moreover, for reasons that collapse the moment we examine them. And so I do hope, if you were still on the fence, maybe I've helped collapse those reasons in your head now that we've further examined it. And I'm glad to answer questions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions online?
I have actually a microphone here. Someone wants to give it to you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I have a quick one.
Wait.
Go for it.
Laura, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So you mentioned that California banned them and British Columbia.
Yes.
Where's the other place? So,
No?
California and British Columbia. And a lot of what we hear is that if you get rid of the rat poisons, there's going to be Ratmageddon. Can you comment on that?
So my understanding is that there's been no Ratmageddon in California or British Columbia. But with British Columbia, they were doing it as a temporary moratorium for a year, and it was so successful that they then adopted it permanently, and they found no adverse impacts to the economy. So then it went from being a temporary moratorium to a permanent one.
No, that was me just telling people on Zoom to put it in the chat. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. First, I want to say thank you. I called you. My name is Megan Sinclair. We talked on the phone
hi.
like last week. So nice to meet you in person. But I wanted to ask, just for the room, and I'm sure some of the people already know, just out of curiosity, what kind of pushback have you had from pest management companies, or what kind of pushback have you heard? It sounds like Arlington was fairly open to some of this, but from other communities, because it sounds like you've talked to a lot of other people, what kinds of pushback could maybe a new group, because we're starting a group in Concord, maybe expect?
Mm-hmm. So I think it depends. When we were doing our, and it started out as just a single, I think, ban proposal, our Warren, before, we were told, and I wasn't the official sponsor, I was a supporting group or endorsing group. But it started out as a ban, I think, before it had to get split into these several pieces of like public lands ban, home rule petition, because of the differences. But when we were having our hearing at the select board, a member of the public who was a pest control operator did show up. I think I sent you maybe the hearing, and he tried to tank the bill and said, but it was clear he didn't really understand the argument, because he was like, well, these are now in tamper-resistant bait stations. To paraphrase his argument, he seemed to say, like, now we're really careful about keeping it in these bait stations. And it's like, well, the animals still get out. It's secondary poison. They did a survey in 2017 of 24 pest companies in Massachusetts, and they found that almost none of them really, like, they all understated the impacts of these eschars. So there seemed to be a lot of, like, misunderstandings of the harms that they cause. And yet all of them called themselves integrated pest management professionals. And they all used them heavily despite being listed as an IPM professional. So, I mean, and I think if that had been a year earlier, I think the town select board might have been, like, spurred by his comments, or maybe would have been a little more reluctant to pass it. But we had just lost our bald eagle. We had just lost our great horned owls. Like, I think as this was happening, like as the hearings were happening, so the select board did not want to incur people's wrath, because they already had a bit of a backlash because a much more conservative bill they shelved the year before, saying there was no rat poison problem or wildlife poisoning problem. I've heard that sometimes these pass without any pest companies showing up, but I know, like, the town of Plymouth, I think somebody got wind of it who, I think he contracts with the city, so he was upset, I think, about potentially losing his contract. So I think he did mount, like, a counter campaign. So I think it just really depends on what the politics there. Sometimes it's good to do something under the radar and not have a lot of people come in instead of, like, blasting it everywhere, because you could let companies know that you're doing this, but they might still get wind of it anyway. So it really varies from community to community.
Yeah, they monitor your social media.
Yeah, so they found they found out about that select board meeting by monitoring a town social media account, that they said they were an ally, an anti-poison ally, and then they showed up to argue that we shouldn't ban these on our public property. But they monitored me specifically, and I've been named in their pest trade magazines and stuff like that.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question on the Zoom.
Okay.
Hello. Okay, great. Someone from Zoom, Lee, was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about exclusion. They say that keeping random mice out of the basement and garage is their main issue.
So there's a really great problem animal control agents, I think, are really great at exclusion service. I'm not an exclusion professional. I think I said I do have on the Save Arlington Wildlife page, I do have some of these hacks about what to do with, steel wool and caulk, if you're kind of on a budget, especially for me as a renter. If you're doing more foundational stuff like basement, I think you can still do those hacks, but you may want to at least call and try to speak to some of these problem animal control agents that can look at more comprehensive fixes. And I know there's a place called the Back Guys. They do bat exclusion in attics, but they do mice exclusion. And that's like one of their specialties, is like exclusion, including for mice. And so they might be able to help if those like more do-it-yourself hacks are not cutting it. I think North Shore Animal Management, or I think they do also a lot of exclusion, and they're also poison-free. Both of these places are poison-free. A lot of pest companies, I've yet to find a pest company that's poison-free, but some problem animal control companies, which are a little different, because they also do removal of pests. Some of them are some of them have licenses in both, but I find that they're more likely to do the more exclusion. But you still want to be really careful and say, I want exclusion, no poison, So those are two companies that could probably help with that. And I think some of them even have the infrared light, which can find the holes. And I think you can buy one of those for yourself on Amazon, but if you do want to get a company and you don't want to like risk trial and error, you can get a company, but if not, you can try that yourself.
Anybody else? Nobody else on Zoom?
So I have a question, Laura, about the status at the State House of the bills that have been sitting around there for so many years. Is there any hope that, I know they came out in '23, I listened to a hearing, and it seemed to be very well represented in terms of citizens, and the pesticide companies weren't very noisy about it.
Yeah.
But it still sat there. Is there any hope that they will do anything, or do you think that the best option now is just to inundate them with applications for local home rule?
Yeah, so, and are you saying the other state, are you talking about the Hawkins bill, or are you talking about? So, I mean, the Hawkins bill is important, but I do want to clarify, a lot of people think it's a ban. It's a tracking bill. It doesn't do anything to prohibit these poisons. It was more about tracking them. And then MDAR, Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, said, oh, well, we're going to start putting a database, so this isn't necessary. But then they don't put the locations they're putting the poison, which to me is the most important part of the tracking, because how are you supposed to correlate how the wildlife are getting harmed if you don't know where the bait stations are in proximity to like a nesting site or something, or a denning site for certain populations of wildlife. Both times the Hawkins bill came out of committee, I kept finding that it was getting watered down a lot. Like, for instance, the first iteration of the Hawkins bill had language that would have required pest companies to disclose up front the impacts of the risks of these products, which, again, the most important thing that I'm struck by is that they can basically lie to you when directly asked, but this would have said that they had to tell you this can harm wildlife, this can harm pets, and then they had to get a signed consent form. They managed to lobby to get that stripped out, which to me, like, stripped the biggest teeth of the bill out. And I still think it's important to measure it, but I do think that also maybe might have deflated a lot of the advocates for that bill, because if you can't even get the pest companies to be transparent about the impacts of their products, I think they said it would be too much paperwork for them. It's not too much for us to like pick up dead wildlife and spend, thousands of dollars out of our pockets to necropsy them, but they didn't want to deal with the extra paperwork of getting consent forms from people. So I think that if the Hawkins bill keeps getting reintroduced, I'm all for supporting it, but my energy is going into getting more and more places to do these home rule petitions. And you've probably heard Mass Audubon is on the bandwagon about this. I think they're actually probably, when they got involved, we had about 6 or 7 of these Save Wildlife groups, but they have a reach that I don't have. So now they have contacts on the Cape, which I don't, or other parts of the state, and I think that's why there are now dozens of these groups, but I think it's because they saw that the home rule petition, I had conversations with them that they saw that as probably the most effective path to get the state to change, is doing that. I do think it's important to do a public lands ban as well for communities because, well, one, the state could argue, why would we pass a home rule petition for a municipality that hasn't enough, they're not confident enough in this to prohibit it on their own lands, but they want us to prohibit it, right? And also just, I think it's important, even if like a community isn't using these poisons, I think it's important to codify that going forward for public health reasons, because, you could have a change in leadership and then they want to use the poisons. So I think that getting public lands bans with home rule petitions are the most effective, and the legal route that we're trying right now too. I hope that answers your question.
Beautiful.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
The legal route that you're trying, that you mentioned, is there any way that the public can help you with that?
Yes, well, so I think things are going to be changing. Things are quickly evolving on that. Like, so the pesticide board, Harvard submitted that petition in May, late May. They've had it for 6 months. Were any of you on the pesticide board calls? So there are the pesticide board and their various subcommittees do have like bi-monthly meetings. So if the public, and those are public, you can go to the pesticide board and see, and they're on Zoom. So if you want to go to those meetings, please go to those meetings. We're on most of them. Either at least 2 or 3, if not all of us in that coalition are usually on those meetings. They don't, depending on the subcommittee, some of them will let us use a chat window. Some of them don't, but they see us, so they know we're there. So I think it's still important for them to feel the pressure that we're on there. And so even just being there, and then if there is a chat or a Q&A board open, like use that, because they'll see it, and it's important. Jane Newhouse did a very moving, were you on that? A moving presentation at the pesticide board meeting the other day. You know, she had to ask, I think, a month and a half in advance for permission to speak. And I think she does now have that she just put up like a change.org petition. I mean, these are just little ways to chip away. But so if you haven't seen the change.org petition, consider signing that. But also writing those individual pesticide board subcommittee members that are listed in that petition and saying, like, we want you to suspend these and do a review. And if you have a personal anecdote, if there's wildlife, you know, a nest near you that you're worried about, or as there's been wildlife mortalities near you, like name those. Because what's frustrating to me about the pesticide board is they keep saying, oh, I think first they said that they weren't aware that this was much of an issue. And I was like, how could they not be? You know, Tufts Wildlife Clinic did a public records request of the pesticide use reports and found that the pesticide use of all these escars increased by 50% for each poison subsequent to 2015, so after it was banned from the shelves, but also the exposure rate. So again, those are going up right in line with each other. So they seem to be correlated, I would argue, but they should be aware because they've been FOIA'd by like Tufts Wildlife Clinic, so it should be on their radar. But then they're saying they don't have the resources to test these animals, and it's like, but we're paying. I'm like, you know, I'm a lower income individual, and I've paid hundreds of dollars out of my own pocket to have these animals tested, and the state, one of the richest states, can't pay a few $1,000s a year to have animals tested. I just don't believe that. So that is very frustrating. There was a dead skunk in August in someone's backyard in my town, and the pesticide board had just told us that, you know, they would start testing animals. I had to really argue with a representative on it to just get them to take the blood. They wouldn't even do the liver, to take the blood from the skunk. It was bleeding post-mortem, so there were signs, right? They wouldn't do it until I could get a wildlife rehabber on the site to do an exam, because they said they have to have a vet or a wildlife rehabber give their professional opinion. But if I'm struggling that much just to get them to take blood, like, it felt like stonewalling, and maybe they are limited in their resources, but then here's the thing, then you should suspend the rodenticides until you have the resources, because otherwise you're playing this grand experiment with like our wildlife. So I think I'm rambling a little past what you said, but yeah, go to those meetings, sign the petition, write the pesticide board. And also the home rule petitions do leverage the legal petition, and the legal petition leverages the home rule petition. So, and for the home rule petitions, no matter the community, the whole state legislature has to vote on it. So talk to your state reps and senators and say, I want you to support all these home rule petitions, because the more that gets pushed, the more likely the legal petition will find leverage too, and vice versa. And if there's not another question, if there is, I can wait, but I'd love to play this tiny little video. It's like 1 minute and 15 seconds. This was, so I started a nonprofit just earlier this year called the Save Massachusetts Wildlife Education Fund, or Save Mass Wildlife. I don't know actually if it's not doing a screen share, so maybe you guys can't see it.
Every year, thousands of bait stations containing rodenticides are placed around homes and businesses. But these poisons don't just kill rodents. Hawks, eagles, owls, foxes, and even pet cats and dogs have died from eating poisoned rodents. This actually can make rodent problems worse, because natural predators are critical in controlling rodent populations. For instance, a single great horned owl eats thousands of mice and rats in a single year. But there is hope. Proper sanitation, such as securing trash bins and removing food sources, can help reduce rodents. Sealing entry points in buildings can prevent rodents from entering. Then, we can let the predators safely do their jobs without risk of poisoning. By choosing not to use rodenticides, we are protecting our wildlife and pets. Together, we can create a safer environment for all creatures. Please visit www.savemasswildlife.org for more information.
Animated short. And I think it's just a nice little tool to use if you're going around and advocating on the municipal level or to businesses or big residential properties wanting them to not use these poisons. You can just show them that video. I wanted to get something that was super brief, like not like this presentation, because not everyone's going to want to sit through an hour or 45-minute presentation. It's a minute and a half, but I think it does a good job of sort of giving the basic message, and then they could go to savearlingtonwildlife.org for like all these other resources, but please share that video if you can. My hope is to get more awareness videos out there, more animated videos, get an MBTA advertising campaign up. I want to get the MBTA because the red line, I want to do it on the red line so it hits Somerville, Cambridge, and Boston, and it hits the State House, so hopefully we'll get commuters who are working at the State House to see that. I'd hope to get that up in the next year as the next legislative session gets underway. And on savemasswildlife.org, you can also donate to the nonprofit. So this is like, it works in tandem with Save Arlington Wildlife, but I wanted to have something that was a nonprofit that doesn't do the political stuff and frees me up to do two things. One is like, again, all these awareness campaigns, advertising campaigns to get people to understand what this is. And two, I want to get a fund to help fund these necropsies and more grants, because again, we're doing a lot of crowdfunding, a lot of people paying out of pocket, and I'd like to formalize that a little bit more. And there is like a donation bin in the back as well. And again, there's that art sale that's going on for the month. If you want to get something for your donation, like go and buy some art.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you.